It's 7 o'clock, this is Sky News Breakfast, and here are our top stories this morning. Facing the rest of her life behind bars, British socialite Ghislaine Maxwell is found guilty of helping Jeffrey Epstein sexually abuse teenage girls. Others must be held accountable. Virginia Giuffre, one of Maxwell's accusers, says she now has faith others connected to the crimes will face justice following the verdict. Meanwhile, Ghislaine Maxwell's family say they are very disappointed with the verdict and have already started the appeals process against the decision.
And I'm in New York, where lawyers for Ghislaine Maxwell's victims say some justice has been served, but more now needs to be done to hold others responsible for their role in Jeffrey Epstein's criminal enterprise.
Setting up for a surge, new Nightingale hubs are rolled out at 8 locations across England as the NHS prepares for a wave of Omicron hospital admissions. Testing times, a shortage of COVID test kits across the country, but the UK Health Security Agency promises 8 million more will be available before the new year. The US calls on China to immediately release employees of the pro-democracy media outlet Strand News after they were arrested by Hong Kong authorities. Baby benefits, Sky News speaks to the companies helping staff start a family through IVF. And the weather mild but windy with rain in the south and showers in the far north for a time. And at 2:15, we'll look at this morning's papers with the journalists Afua Adam and Thomas Copeland. Hello there, very good morning. Thanks for joining us. The 60-year-old British socialite Ghislaine Maxwell is facing the rest of her life behind bars after being found guilty of recruiting underage girls to be sexually abused by Jeffrey Epstein. Maxwell, who was described as dangerous and Epstein's partner in crime by the prosecution during her 3-week trial, was convicted on 5 of the 6 counts she was charged with. Her accusers, including Virginia Giuffre, say others connected to the crimes must now be held accountable following the verdict. Meanwhile, Maxwell's family say they've already started the appeal process against the decision. Well, a warning, this report from our US correspondent, Martha Kellner, does contain some flash photography.
Ghislaine Maxwell was the socialite whose manners and magnetism attracted princes and presidents. But it was those same qualities she used to ensnare girls from troubled backgrounds, teenagers whom she served up for abuse by Jeffrey Epstein. Her siblings were in court as the verdict was read out. They know she'll almost certainly spend the rest of her life in prison. So too do her lawyers. Laura, I wonder if you can reflect on why you think that this jury believed the prosecution's case that Ghislaine Maxwell was a sexual predator. It was the verdict her accusers say is long overdue. Among them, Sarah Ransom, who was in court for some of the trial.
What was it that Ghislaine did to manipulate girls in order to serve them up to Jeffrey Epstein? What was her role in the crime?
So Ghislaine was the main enforcer. She was, even before I met Ghislaine, Jeffrey said, you answer to Ghislaine. She is the lady of the house. She is, you just don't cross her. She forced me into Jeffrey's room to be raped. And then when I walked out, limped, whatever you do when you've just been brutally raped, I looked at her, and that's why it was really important for me to be there and look at her, because when I looked at her, after she forced me into that room to be raped, she smiled. And that's why I had to be there, because, you know what? I smiled right back at her when I saw her.
4 survivors took the stand in this case. They were girls when they were abused. They're now grown women who stepped out of the shadows and into this court to tell their story. And ultimately, it was that testimony which brought down Ghislaine Maxwell. But after the verdict, her family and friends remained defiant.
We firmly believe in Ghislaine's innocence. Obviously, we are very disappointed with the verdict. We have already started working on the appeal, and we are confident that she will be vindicated.
Your Excellency's presidents, lords, ladies and gentlemen.
Maxwell once used her platform to address the UN. She travelled the world in a way only the super wealthy ever will. But her privilege in the end was no protection for the crimes she committed. Martha Kellner, Sky News, New York.
And Martha has the latest from New York.
There was a huge amount of tension in the court, I think mainly because this verdict had taken much longer than many expected to be returned. Judge Alison Nathan got out her yellow note and said, "We have a verdict." At that point, there was an audible intake of breath from everyone in that courtroom and in the overflow courtrooms to watch this hearing, this deliberation period take place. Ghislaine Maxwell sat relatively motionless, rather devoid of emotion, as the charges against her and the verdicts were read out. She was found guilty of 5 of the 6 charges against her. As that final charge was read out, count 6, the most serious count on the charge sheet, she was found guilty of sex trafficking, which carries a maximum 40-year sentence in prison. She simply looked down at the table in front of her, the defence table in front of her. She took a sip of water from her paper cup. She then stood up. There was a very brief pat on the back from one of her defence lawyers, Jeffrey Epstein. There was then the briefest of glances behind her to her family, who was sat on the front row of that courtroom, her sisters Isabel, and Christine, and her brother Kevin. She gave them a brief glance before US Marshals led her out of that courtroom. Afterwards, her lawyer, Bobby Sternheim, as you saw there in my report, spoke out and said her family will appeal. They are very much defiant, in disbelief at this verdict.
Martha Kellner there in New York for us. Now, the NHS is setting up new Nightingale surge hubs across England to deal with a potential wave of Omicron hospital admissions. Work on 8 sites, each with a capacity of around 100 patients, is set to begin as early as this week as the NHS prepares to go on a war footing against the virus. Sky Sarja Chowdhury reports.
Last year's New Year's resolution to help the national vaccine programme.
So, that is you all done. Hooray! Thank you. Yeah, let's do it.
Nearly 1,000 hours later, and nobody in the east of England has volunteered more hours than Alex Spence.
It's all about them getting to do things when they're freed up from this. So we had a lady the other day where she said I'd literally saved her wedding because she needed a vaccination within the next 2 days, or she wasn't going to be able to get to Barbados for the wedding.
It's not just wedding days being saved. Volunteer contribution is also helping keep pressure off an NHS under strain. Despite record-breaking vaccination figures this past fortnight, Omicron remains on the rise and the NHS is taking no chances. This is a new temporary Nightingale hub being built, one of an initial 8 sites across England. In London, the hub will be here at St George's Hospital. NHS trusts have been asked to help identify more sites like gyms and education centres that can be converted to help create up to 4,000 so-called super surge beds. The expansion comes as the number of people in hospitals with COVID rose above 10,000 for the first time since March.
What we're doing here is we're preparing for the worst whilst hoping for the best. It's a no-regrets approach. What you don't want to do is hit a point where you need to treat very large numbers of patients, but you simply don't have the facilities and capacity to do it. Questions remain over who will staff the new hubs. The Royal College of Nursing has sounded the alarm over worker shortages and low morale. A survey of more than 9,000 UK nursing staff has found that 57% said they're considering or planning on leaving their job. Around 3/4 said that in the last year they'd worked when feeling unwell. And 18% said they weren't able to take annual leave.
We've got a nursing profession that's under intolerable pressures. It's a workforce in crisis. And if we don't address the crisis in the nursing profession, then we won't have a health and care service that's fit to deliver for those that are in desperate need of it and deserve actually the care that the health service should be able to deliver.
The Nightingale surge hubs become the latest response to the rapid spread of Omicron and the prospect of another major wave of people relying on the NHS for treatment. Sadia Chowdhury, Sky News.
Well, staying with COVID-19, and an extra 8 million home testing kits are to be made available before the new year after shortages caused by exceptionally high demand. The UK Health Security Agency has warned that increased demand could continue to lead to a shortage in lateral flow and PCR tests, both of which were unavailable for home delivery across the UK via the government website on Wednesday. Professor Alex Richter, a clinical immunologist at the University of Birmingham, says difficulty accessing PCR tests is forcing her family into isolation after her daughter returned a positive lateral flow result.
I look after individuals with vulnerable immune systems and so are at high risk. So I wouldn't be able to go back to work without a PCR test. I probably wouldn't go back and see patients face to face anyway because of how vulnerable my patient cohort is. But it doesn't allow any of us to release, and we would have to remain in an isolated manner for the next 10 days.
Let's bring in our political correspondent, Joe Pike, who's at Westminster for us. Morning, Joe. So why are we experiencing this lack of tests?
Simply, it's because we have seen a huge uptick in the number of cases. That, of course, is going to lead to people wanting to test to see whether they have COVID-19 or not, but also partly because the self-isolation rules have changed. Last week, the UK government reduced the amount of time you need to self-isolate if you test positive from 10 days to 7, as long as you have a lateral flow test and test negative on days 6 and 7. That is likely to increase demand, as is the guidance from the government that if you've come into close contact with someone who's positive, you don't need to self-isolate, but ideally you would take lateral flow tests every day for a week. And the shortage of tests is certainly continuing this morning. On the UK government's website, there are no home tests for the general public or for essential workers in the NHS and care staff. And in terms of the walk-in and drive-through testing centres, those are not available in Scotland, Northern Ireland and 8 out of 9 English regions. This challenge is continuing. The government are saying they're expanding capacity and that people should check their website every few hours. What we are, though, perhaps seeing, Jonathan, is a change in the way people are behaving, acting more responsibly in testing regularly. That is becoming part of everyday life, but it is only possible for us to do that if we can get the test from government. And for now, it's quite difficult.
All right, Joe, thank you. Well, we can get some more now on those pressures being felt by nurses and the warning from the Royal College of Nursing that there's a growing sense of disillusionment amongst staff. Joining me now is the Royal College of Nursing's General Secretary, Pat Cullen. You saw her in that report a little bit earlier. Very good morning to you. Thanks for being with us. We'll talk about all the pressures that nursing staff are under in a moment. But first of all, just give me your reaction to these COVID hubs that are being set up. A sensible idea or not so easy to do?
Well, I don't know about how easy they are to do, because you can set up all the hubs that you wish to set up, but if you don't have the nursing staff to actually care for the patients that are going to be placed in those hubs, that places more challenges on the nursing workforce. The nursing workforce already are struggling massively to care for the patients that are already in hospital. And if we set up hubs and put up additional beds, that's going to even place more pressure on those nurses. So at this point in time, we have no idea how we're going to be staffing those additional hubs as they're set up.
It appears that these hubs are going to be largely for patients who are getting better and are close to being discharged from hospital. Could you argue that actually this will make life easier for those nursing staff inside the main building who are trying to look after the critically ill? Well,
where you see a bed in a hospital, you inevitably see nurses. So those beds will still have to be staffed by nurses. The patients in those beds will still require nursing care. So the nurses that are already providing the critical care in hospitals will even be spread thinner across those areas unless there's another plan to staff those beds and care for those patients in another way. But at this point in time, that information isn't available. So we are working on the premise that if there's a bed put up in a hospital or in a makeshift hospital, inevitably that bed requires a nurse to be present to provide the care for patients.
We're heading into another year. It'll be our third year with COVID hanging over us. What does that mean for those in your profession?
Well, we can see in this report today the stark statistics in the report that has been issued today. But it's not just the statistics. Behind each and every one of the statistics in that report, there's a story to be told. And we can see those stories in the report that's being published today. And personally and professionally, each and every nurse has paid a massive price over the last number of years. They headed into this pandemic with 50,000 nursing vacancies in the NHS in England. And then on top of that, we now have a situation where thousands of nurses are off isolating. So you can imagine what it's like for those nurses that are still getting up as we speak this morning to start a 13, 14-hour shift and care for patients with a depleted workforce and knowing that there's no end to it, that it's just relentless. And the words that they say to me on a daily basis is that it has become intolerable. And throughout my 37-year nursing career, I never thought that I would see a report issued today that shows 57% of our workforce wishing to leave the profession. That certainly was never something that I thought I would see in my time.
And of course, we're all hugely grateful to the work that nurses do, but we are in unprecedented times, aren't we? COVID has taken its toll on so many people in so many different walks of life. Is it fair to completely blame the government for the situation that nursing staff find themselves in? Well,
the nursing workforce has been subject to cost-cutting exercises year on year by successive governments. There has been an absolute total absence and lack of workforce planning, cuts made to nursing, permanent posts filled with temporary vacancies in order to get money out of the service. Those are not issues that have been created by the nursing workforce. Indeed, the nursing workforce has stepped up and stepped out for the public and patients time and time again. So someone has to take responsibility. But what we're saying is moving forward, there needs to be accountability and responsibility for long-term workforce planning. There needs to be investment in the service, and we need a workforce that is fit for purpose, that can deliver for the public and take the pressure off the front line, those nurses that are trying every day to do their very best for patients so that they can go home after their shift and know that there's not care left undone, that they don't feel that their patients are being subjected to unsafe care. When we have got a workforce that is absolutely highly valued by the public, that are skilled and expert in providing that care, and it's down to the government, unfortunately, I do have to say that, it is down to the government to make sure that the patients and the public have got the workforce to provide that care for them.
OK, we must leave it there. Pat Cullen, General Secretary of the Royal College of Nursing, thank you.
Thank you.
OK, let's take a look at some of the other stories making news this morning. The US has called on China to immediately release employees of the pro-democracy media outlet Stand News after they were arrested by Hong Kong authorities. The UK government also joined the US in condemning the actions, calling the arrests a curtailing of media freedoms. But Hong Kong leader Carrie Lam claimed the arrests were a law enforcement action and were not aimed at the media industry. The Foreign Secretary, Liz Truss, has pledged up to £105 million of UK emergency aid to help vulnerable countries tackle the Omicron COVID-19 variant. The Foreign Office says the aid will help countries most in need fight COVID-19, with a particular focus on Africa. It's hoped the funding will help millions of people by supporting measures to reduce transmission, scale up testing and boost oxygen supplies. Well, that announcement comes exactly 1 year after the UK became the first country to approve the Oxford-AstraZeneca vaccine. 2.5 billion doses of that jab have since been administered around the world, including 50 million here in the UK. Health Secretary Sajid Javid says the Oxford-AstraZeneca vaccine has been absolutely pivotal in saving millions of lives globally. Now, a maintenance worker has suffered serious injuries after being attacked by a tiger when he entered an unauthorised area of a Florida zoo. Authorities at the Naples Zoo shot and killed the tiger to free the man from its jaws. Now, almost 100 convicted terrorists are being assessed for release from prison by the parole board, with several cases being decided in the next few months. Sky's Emma Birchley is in the newsroom for us now. Morning, Emma. So give us some more detail.
Well, we're actually talking about 92 convicted terrorists. It would have been in the past that they would have been automatically released at the halfway point in their sentence. But emergency laws were brought in February of 2020 following 2 terror attacks committed by recently released terrorist prisoners. Attacks at Fishmongers Hall and Streatham, 2 within 3 months, both in London. And so now these convicted terrorists have to serve at least 2/3 of their sentence, and then they have to appear before a parole panel who have to decide if they're safe before they're released. So the kind of people we're talking about are Jawad Akbar, for example. He plotted to bomb the Blue Water shopping centre in Kent and the Ministry of Sound nightclub in London back in 2004. Jack Coulson, a teenager who made a pipe bomb in his bedroom, which was covered with Nazi flags. So you can see why people would be concerned about the prospect of these kind of people re-entering society. Now, the parole board say that public safety is the top priority, and that actually these parole board panels that make these decisions are really being beefed up with more specialists, the kind of people, judges, senior police officers, prison governors, psychologists, psychiatrists. So they're the people who are making these decisions. The problem, according to Nick Aldworth, who is a former national counter-terrorism coordinator, is that these people are clever and they can cheat the system.
The trouble with ideologically based offending is it is quite easy to conceal your deep views. But of course, those are also views that come and go. And, you know, there will be a case coming up this year where an individual had not been on the police radar for several years and then committed an appalling act.
These are not easy decisions to make about the future of these convicted terrorists. So to give you an example, since the new legislation came in 22 months ago, 117 cases have been referred to the parole board. Of those, only 11 people have been released and 14 have been refused release.
Welcome back. You're watching Sky News Breakfast. Now, the 60-year-old British socialite Ghislaine Maxwell is facing the rest of her life behind bars after being found guilty of recruiting underage girls to be sexually abused by Jeffrey Epstein. Maxwell, who is described as Epstein's partner in crime by the prosecution during her 3-week trial, was convicted on 5 of the 6 counts that she was charged with. Our US correspondent Greg Mylan takes a look at the background of the case and verdict.
During Ghislaine Maxwell's trial, a teenage accuser was asked why she didn't speak out or fight back. Because, she said, she knew she was isolated. Here, in a mansion owned by Jeffrey Epstein, on an 8,000-acre ranch in the middle of the desert. Isolated, she said, with just those 2 people. The photos of that palatial home in New Mexico now come marked with evidence labels. The property revealed in the trial as being central to the sex trafficking operation of Epstein, and Maxwell's role laid bare by those brought here, their experience of what went on beyond the gate of Zorro Ranch.
And this is just one property in a global portfolio in which Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell could operate. Exclusive homes in New York and Florida and the Virgin Islands, where, as you can see, they could stay well away from the public gaze. And as the trial heard, the means to travel between them that also kept them in their own private world.
Because behind the gates and the security cameras, Zorro Ranch has its own airstrip. Freedom of movement for Epstein and Maxwell and their guests here. The flight logs of Epstein's private jets revealed in the trial the world of the rich, famous and powerful in which they moved. With Maxwell at its heart, a who's who of politicians, power brokers and performers. None of those named in court were accused of any wrongdoing, but they demonstrated a couple with unrivaled connections. The lawyer for some of Epstein's accusers, ones whose allegations weren't heard during the trial, say it was Maxwell's presence that won the trust of those who became victims.
Mr. Epstein would have never been able to abuse the number of women that he did had it not been for the part that Ghislaine Maxwell played in that sexual pyramid. The wealth and influence that Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell had throughout the world allowed them to continue on this path for as long as they did. The problems associated with their wealth and influence is that they were always given the benefit of the doubt in situations where questions should have clearly been raised.
All the many hundreds of people who have sent messages of support.
Those who know Ghislaine Maxwell point to her past and the death of her father, the disgraced tycoon Robert Maxwell, on his yacht 30 years ago.
She was very upset. She was crying about her daddy. She was obviously, a daddy's girl, the youngest.
Ken Lennox identified Robert Maxwell's body after his death. The death of Epstein, he believes, drove prosecutors to go after Ghislaine Maxwell.
They lost Jeffrey, and she was the next. There's no one else visible to punish for what happened to these girls. I think she was under the influence of a man who, in many ways, resembled her father.
Towards the end of Ghislaine Maxwell's trial, the jury was shown this video from inside the home in Palm Beach in Florida, where prosecutors say she and Jeffrey Epstein committed horrifying crimes. Their exclusive world is now no more. That house has been demolished. For many, the memories can never be erased. Greg Milam, Sky News.
Well, back here, the British Dental Association says the government's decision to impose new activity targets is the wrong choice at the wrong time. From the 1st of January, NHS dentists in England will have to meet 85% of their pre-COVID levels or face financial penalties. Well, joining me now is the chair of the British Dental Association, Eddie Crouch. Very good morning to you. Thanks for joining us here on Sky News Breakfast. Meeting 85% of your pre-COVID appointments doesn't sound too tough. Why is it a problem?
Well, it's a massive problem at the moment. We've had yesterday 185,000 people testing positive. Many of the teams, the dental teams, are struggling, working flat out. And 2/3 of those teams have not managed to achieve that target previously. And we're going into deeper numbers within the pandemic. We're having problems with staffing. Many of our staff are off with symptoms or having to self-isolate. Many of our patients are cancelling. The contract itself is not very satisfactory. And setting a target like this is setting dentists up to fail.
So what exactly have the government said then? 85% of pre-COVID levels. What else have you got to achieve?
Well, that in itself is a real shock to the profession because, as I say, only a third of practices previously were hitting that target.
Why is that?
Sorry?
Why is that?
Well, we've been working to incredible cross-infection control procedures since the pandemic started. We've had a situation where we've had to have downtime after each particular patient. Trying to see 85% of the numbers of patients that we saw pre-pandemic is just not possible.
Is there not an argument, though, that some of those measures can be relaxed now? We already know that dental practices are some of the cleanest places that you can go to. You've been wearing PPE well before we even knew what PPE stood for. Social distancing, for example. I know some dentists say that you have to have social distancing in the waiting rooms. Well, nowhere else is doing social distancing. Why do you need to?
Because we're seeing patients that are potentially vulnerable within our surgeries, and no other area of the health service is actually being put under this pressure. My colleagues feel they're not being supported properly, like other areas of the health service. We understand there is a massive backlog. 35 million appointments have been lost. We've got the situation where many patients, Health Watch, for example, are reporting that it's one of the major issues that they're getting reported within the health service. We need support, not targets that are put there that are setting dentists up to fail. Many practices are wondering about their long-term future in the NHS because they don't see the support coming from the NHS at this particular time.
You say that you're facing more pressures than other areas of the NHS, but how can you possibly believe that? We've just been speaking to the Royal College of Nursing, saying that they're under huge stress and pressure at the moment. I mean, nobody saw COVID coming and we have to deal with it. Is it not time for you to think about your own working practices and how you can change them to improve so that these targets can be at least got close to?
Well, I think dental practices have adapted absolutely fantastically to the problems of the pandemic. But other areas of the health service have been receiving funding, for example, additional support. And dentistry has not got that. In the spending review that was done recently and the £5 billion that was there to actually deal with backlogs in the NHS, not a single penny of that has come to dentistry. And it's not all about the money, but dentists feel like they're not being supported at this particular time. And we are working in vulnerable situations, close up to patients, dealing with aerosol generating procedures. Yes, we have all the procedures in place, but that takes time, and that doesn't allow us to see the volume of patients that the NHS are expecting us to see.
OK, you make your point very well. We appreciate your time this morning. Eddie Crouch, Chair of the British Dental Association. Thank you. OK, let's see how your Thursday weather is shaping up.
Look forward to brighter skies. The weather, sponsored by Qatar Airways.
Well, it's been so mild, hasn't it, of late? You may not even need a coat today because it's going to remain mild today, but it will turn colder before the new year, especially on Sunday. It's rather grey for most, with rain across central Britain, heavy showers for northern Scotland, dry elsewhere. Central Britain will largely dry up during the morning, although it'll stay grey and drizzly on western hills. But the south can expect further patchy rain. The south of Ireland will see heavier, more prolonged outbreaks moving in. Elsewhere, showers over northern Scotland will clear.
The weather, sponsored by Qatar Airways.
Well, thanks for your company this morning. Do stay with us. Coming up, we're going to take a look through the morning's papers with the broadcasters and journalists, Afua Adam and Thomas Copeland. Don't go away.
Did you know if we tried to use less energy, we could help reduce air pollution? What, like turning off the lights and stuff? Yeah.
Central Britain will see early rain mostly dying out during the morning, although it'll stay rather grey and drizzly on western hills. But the south will see further patchy outbreaks. The south of Ireland can expect heavier, more prolonged rain by midday. Elsewhere, northern Scotland will see early showers clearing, leaving most northern and central parts fine. It'll stay very mild. Rain in the south will clear into central parts during the afternoon. Southwesterly winds mean air pollution levels will remain low, with most places between 1 and 3 on the Air Quality Index.
The Air Quality Report, sponsored by Philips Air Purifiers.
Hello again, it's 7:47 if you're just joining us. A very good morning. Time to look through the papers. Today I'm joined by journalists Afua Adam and Thomas Copeland. Nice to see you both again. Why don't we kick off with you this time, Thomas? Front page of the Mirror, a story that broke late last night. Our top story, of course, and the Mirror, their headline, simply guilty, the conviction of Ghislaine Maxwell. And when you read the detail, it really is very depressing indeed.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very disturbing story through and through. Watching the Sky News reports this morning, though, I mean, what strikes you is how long Maxwell was able to get away with what she did. The BBC have a comment on their website from their New York correspondent, actually, this morning that struck me. A comment about how the first time that this correspondent had come across Maxwell was a decade ago, chasing her down a street in Manhattan, asking her about exactly these kind of allegations. So for at least 10 years, this has been, you know, something that at least journalists were aware of, and considerably longer than that for the victims. Epstein died in 2019, so he'll never be able to fully answer to his alleged crimes. But it would appear that Maxwell was very much a linchpin for all of those. But of course, there's no dignity in crime, and much of Maxwell's defence relied upon turning on her once partner in crime, accusing Epstein of using her as a scapegoat, and how he was very much in control of all of this. But of course, watching most of the coverage, it's fairly clear that Maxwell was fundamental to these crimes taking place. Epstein couldn't have done it by himself, is the allegation being made. So you get the distinct impression, though, from all of this that this is really only scratching the surface about, for 10 years, for far longer than 10 years, between holidays and holiday homes and travel and houses across the world, that you have sort of a network underneath which these kind of crimes were taking place.
Yeah.
You hope that this is the beginning of a process, not only for the actual victims, but also a much wider process for society in general, uncovering some of the criminality that's taken place, clearly hidden beneath that web of power, wealth and influence.
Yeah, you make a very good point there, Afua. The ramifications of this case will continue, won't they?
Oh, absolutely. And like Thomas said earlier on, I think this is probably going to maybe open the floodgates for other people who were victims of Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell to come forward and talk about what they went through. And I think that will be a good thing, so they can be fully held accountable for the crimes they committed against so many young people. But I also think this reminds me, when we talk about these kind of cases, money, wealth and power and what they can do to hide your crimes, it reminds me of the R. Kelly case. Again, journalists knew for years of the crimes that he committed, like journalists knew for years of the crimes that Ghislaine Maxwell and Jeffrey Epstein committed, but they were able to cover them up, like I said, for years. So I think this is far from over, that more people will come forward. But I also think it will encourage people who were perhaps victims of other people, we don't know who they may be, but who have gone through something similar, to come forward and say, look, I went through this, even if it is against a person who has money and power. I think this is going to egg people on and say that, you know what, you can get justice if that's what you deserve. So I think we could see more of these cases coming forward as well. But I think Ghislaine Maxwell probably going to prison for the rest of her life will definitely give her victims some sense of closure. I also think this could put the spotlight on Prince Andrew. Of course, he has denied all the allegations against him, but US authorities are still looking to speak to him in connection to this case.
OK, we seem to be losing your signal again, Afua. It's not a good morning for your broadband. Thomas, let's move on to testing and the latest issues there, because it's still a real problem, isn't it? People struggling to get lateral flow tests and PCR tests. The Guardian saying that the Prime Minister is to blame for the testing shambles.
This has been a major problem for huge numbers of people up and down the country. I mean, only in the last couple of days, I've been checking the website trying to order some lateral flow tests, and you find that in many cases they're simply unavailable. I know that there are even more acute problems in England, for example, than there are in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. And the PCR test is a very important part of that. The way that the process is meant to work is you take a lateral flow test. If you get a positive lateral flow test, you send off for a PCR test. So once you start to get not only a problem with lateral flow tests coming through the door, but also then PCR tests due to an increased demand, you very quickly walk into a system that seems to be falling apart. Now, I suppose the reason that the finger's been pointed at the Prime Minister in this article and elsewhere is, for example, him encouraging people to go out, and actually the government saying have a good time on New Year's Eve, but increasingly saying that testing is the key. So in the past, we've talked about how, vaccines are the way out of this. Now there seems to be a little bit a move towards saying, it's about testing is really important at this current phase of the pandemic. But the problem with doing that, of course, is you need to make sure that before you tell people, get testing, get the lateral flow test, get the PCR test, you have enough capacity in order to allow people to do that. When you've got people trying to get home for Christmas, maybe see some of their family, you've got folks going out on New Year's Eve, you've also got, and this is it's sort of a zeitgeisty thing, isn't it? When you hear of one person getting a test or your family's getting a test, you're more likely to do it yourself. You're more likely to order more. We should be encouraging people to get more tests and to do a quick test before they go out somewhere. But there's no point in doing that if it's going to take 48 hours for people to, for far longer than that, or people will never be able to get tests. And what that actually will lead to is more people inclined to break the rules. For example, if you want to visit maybe a family member in a nursing home or a hospital and you're encouraged to take a lateral flow test before you go there, if you aren't able to get one, then clearly it is the case that, you know, your desperation maybe to see a family member will overcome those initial thoughts to do with trying to be COVID safe.
You make a very good point there, and that is a real problem. The government's saying that 8 million tests are going to be put into the system very soon. We shall wait and see. Staying with COVID, we've got Afua back now. Afua, the Financial Times talking about the tsunami of COVID around the world. It is a real issue, isn't it? While cases obviously going up here in the UK and the US as well, more record levels of COVID cases. But elsewhere in the world, really, the problems are only just beginning.
Oh, yes, absolutely. And this is the Director General of the WHO, Dr. Tedros Ghebreyesus, and he has warned of this tsunami, as you put it, of COVID around the world. We've had record cases in the US, 265,000 daily, in France, 208,000, in Germany, 13,000 Omicron cases. And he is warning of a surge of Omicron and Delta all over the world. India is reporting a surge in cases as well. And he says, you know, even though Omicron is being reported as being milder, that we shouldn't be complacent. The cases are going to put pressure on healthcare workers and healthcare systems around the world. But he also commented on booster vaccines, which I thought was really interesting. And he said that there has been more booster vaccines given out in richer countries than there has been the total number of vaccines, that's first and second doses, that have gone out in lower and middle income countries. And that booster vaccination.
Afua, we need to give your broadband a booster. That's what we're going to have to try and sort out for the next hour. Thomas, we talked about dinosaurs earlier. Just give me 20 seconds on the tequila fish.
Well, it's the headline of the day. The Guardian is reporting it. The Times is reporting another shot, they said, for the tequila fish. Well, hey, wake up, favourite headline of the day. It's a fish that Chester Zoo, actually in the UK, has helped to rehabilitate. It was declared extinct from the wild in 2003 and it's being reintroduced. You can see a picture of it there, lovely little thing, back into the wild. So a little bit of good news story and a wonderful headline.
Thomas, we're out of time. Thanks very much.